So, Grail Country has some special guests today joining us. We have our regulars, of course, Sherry and Jed, but then we also have Paul Vanderklay and of Paul Vanderklay's channel, and James Kourtides of Rooster Scrow podcast, who I've done some stuff with before that you may have seen. And I've talked to Paul before too. So this combination has never worked together, but various sub combinations have in the past. So we're here today to discuss our thoughts on Alexander Dugin's political thought and his idea of the fourth political theory or Eurasianism, and how we think that, what is its meaning? What are we to make of it? Should we be concerned about it? Is there anything good about it? What parts of it should are not so good? Yeah, so that's kind of the general framing of the discussion here. And I always like to open it up to like kind of initial thoughts from any of my guests, if they want to go ahead and say something to open.
I plan to do more listening than talking because I don't feel like I know much about it. So I kind of came here to learn. So
all right,
if I don't say much, that's why.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into the point. At kind of before we started recording, I discussed that I was interested in talking a little bit about the definition of racism that Dugin gives in chapter 2 of Fourth Political Theory, and he let's see if I can find it. Oh, there we go. Okay, he says the fourth political theory rejects all forms and varieties of racism and all forms of the normative hierarchicalization of society based on ethnic, religious, social, technological, economic, or cultural grounds. Societies can be compared, but we cannot state that one of them is objectively better than the others. Such an assessment is always subjective, and any attempt to raise a subjective assessment to the status of a theory is racism. So,
Can you read that real quick?
Yeah. Which part? You want me to reread it?
Yeah, just go ahead and reread that.
Okay, sure.
I think it's important, and I want to make sure.
Say, the fourth political theory rejects all forms and varieties of racism and all forms of the normative hierarchicalization of society based on ethnic, religious, social, technological, economic, or cultural grounds. Societies can be compared, but we cannot state that one of them is objectively better than the others. Such an assessment is always subjective, and any attempt to raise a subjective statement to the status of a theory is racism.
Okay.
So it's always subjective, and any attempt to raise it above subjectivism is racism?
Well, he's essentially, what he's saying is that if any comparison where you would suggest that there is a hierarchical ordering of cultures is inherently racist.
Okay.
So if you wanted to suggest, for example, like that, let's say Putin's Russia is morally superior, according to whatever standard of analysis you're using, to the ancient Aztec culture that engaged in human sacrifice, you'd have no basis of making that judgment.
And it would be racist to do so.
And it would be racist to do so.
Because it's always subjective.
Yes.
Right. And so I think, I mean, it becomes difficult. And I think this is where Dugin is such a challenging thinker to follow, is if you were to use that paradigm in other elements of his thinking, especially what he has to say specifically about liberalism, which, for the record, like, I also have problems with. Like, I think that liberalism is a very flawed system. But then there becomes really we still have not navigated through kind of that postmodern morass of total subjectivity. right? Where do we have kind of it still seems to diminish really a subject object relationship, right? And the ability to make, you know, meaningful value judgments, maybe not always the correct ones, but at least a meaningful statement of value, whether that's on race or other areas of his theory. And so that's, you know, I mean, obviously, like, let's say from like a perspective of a Christian, I am, you know, fairly comfortable saying, making a value judgment that a society that engages in human sacrifice is morally problematic. But if you're going to be called a racist on the basis of doing that, then you've really eliminated any meaningful and valuable critique.
You've also made the definition of racism even less meaningful than it is under like standard woke ideology. Like it's
Yeah.
Yeah.
any value judgment of any kind becomes racism under that definition.
Yeah, I think so I think it is important to, you know, juxtapose the fourth political theory with what he sees as the problematic, which is the first three political theories, which is liberalism,
Right.
you know, beginning in the 18th century, and then two reactions, reaction from the left, which was communism, and a reaction from the right, which was fascism. I think he would say that racism, calling something racism, is inherently, you know, subjected to liberalism and its reactions. And in a fourth political theory, concepts or categories as racism need to be effaced, along with many other categories, ethnos and things of that nature. And something he states later, he talks about how we need to get, in the way he brings up Heidegger, and maybe this be jumping a little forward, but to speak to your subject object discernment there, he says we need to get to the place prior to the split between subject and object.
Mhm.
And that's part of Heidegger's project, was to get to the originary inclination of philosophy and during the pre-Socratics. He says, what question was being asked, you know, during the time of Heraclitus? And he says that there's a problematic between making a decision between physis and logos.
But the problem is that, and the reason I think Heidegger fails is that proper way to do that is through contemplation and not thought.
Well,
Like
he calls the fourth political theory in practice contemplation. So he wants to reverse.
Right.
He says some crazy stuff later on.
But right, exactly. But the problem, yes. And he's politicizing both like theology and contemplation in the process of doing that.
Mhm.
Like, and explicitly doing so, and thinks it's a good idea.
Yeah. Well, he says explicitly that we need to get to the root. He has this idea of radical subjectivity. So in getting to the root, he says, why not the head? You know, why don't we be talking about the head, divine and spiritual matters? He says, this is very deep, and he doesn't go into why. He says, we need to get to the root, to the chaos. So he's all for injecting chaos into the system,
Right.
by dismantling the hierarchies that are based on this dichotomy between theory and action, subject and object, mentality and activity. So he's saying that postmodernism did that, right? He said
Right.
postmodernism blurred the line between theory and practice, but he said they didn't go far enough by blurring the line on the
But I
vertical
think he
axis.
goes, I
Yeah.
think he goes a little, I mean, I understand the idea of using postmodernism. I mean, as much as he hates modernity and liberalism, I understand the embrace of postmodernism as a deconstructive tool against those things. And in terms of, here's what I agree with about it. Here's what I agree with. His basic thesis about the first three political theories, I accept on face value. The idea that there needs to be a fourth political theory, I think is correct. And his critique of both liberalism and modernity are essentially right. But I don't actually see a fourth political theory that actually develops within the course of his text that I can distinguish from postmodernism itself.
Well, and I think that's my,
And his claim that we stand for tradition and the absolute is totally ridiculous based on what he's working from.
and
You can't do that and at the same time defer any notion of logos, which he does.
well, and I think that this is just what makes the book and what makes Dugin particularly challenging on this is you can read the entire fourth political theory and come away with the question of what is the fourth political theory.
Okay, so that's what I wanted to.
Right. But the thing is that he's also important to read, though, because for the same reason
Oh,
it's
yeah.
important to read Marx, because like, even
Yeah.
though you may disagree with Marx at the end of the day, like Marx's critique of capitalism is spot on. The
Yeah.
problem is, what does Marx leave you with?
Yeah. And,
Other
and-
than his critique. And I think that Dugin runs into the same problem in the fourth political theory.
well, and I'll probably be a little bit more pointed in my remarks with Dugin in certain respects, because I think that, and this is coming, like, obviously, full disclosure, I'm progressive. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't call myself a liberal, but I definitely am one of the people who thinks that the arrow of time moves forward. That's defensible at a, you know, scientific level. That is how entropy works, right? Is that directs the forward motion of time. And so we can't go backward. And I do think that retrieval is possible in the past, and there are certain elements of the past that shouldn't be lost. But I do find, you know, myself, you know, as a reader of Dugin, consistently feeling like left with the impression that in his full scale assault on liberalism, which in certain respects I can agree with, I think that it essentially, like, what it negates often is the accomplishments of liberalism and the fact that liberalism is growing out of a Christian context.
Yes.
You know, go back into Tom Holland's work in Dominion. There really isn't an area of Western and now even global culture that has not been thoroughly inflected by Christianity. So what we're looking at in liberalism, whether it's in its most postmodern or early modern, you know, mid-modern iterations, it's a Christian system.
Well, to get right to the core, Jed, to utterly reject any possibility of a humanity that is truly universal is to reject Christ.
Mm-hmm.
He's also ignoring the Russian tradition of sobernos, which is to look to what is in common instead of what is different for a source of unity and love.
And so that's going to be where I will camp out, and I'll probably bring it out. But James, I've seen some of your videos, and your material on Dugin is really helpful at an informative level of beginning to grapple with this thought, because it's pretty subtle and complex. I mean, he's an intimidating writer. My critique from the Christian perspective is not as a progressive Christian, but really as like a question to me is, okay, maybe there is a fourth political theory out there. But my question is, what does that actually have to do from a Christian's perspective with Christ's teachings on the kingdom?
Right.
And he says he gives an answer to that in the negative, and he says that the Antichrist will be born out of what started as Christianity. He sees liberalism in its late phase as the underpinnings of the Antichrist, right? Which latches on and parasitically feeds off of Christianity, right? And he explicitly states that we have two forms of time. We have the arrow of time. Like if you look at a clock, it's ticking the appropriate time. And he says we have time from a spiritual perspective, which is the inverse. And he brings in Blavatsky's imaginary numbers. So the square root of -1 is I. So from the materialist perspective, things look fragmented. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But from a spiritual perspective, that actual clock goes backwards, right? He's pretty, it's pretty esoteric stuff when he's talking about that. But he's saying that liberalism, based in the degradation of Christianity and its reactionaries, communism and fascism, fall within this proceeding towards the Antichrist. In order to abstract yourself, in order to get out of the logic of this, you need to go back. You need to think the new, and that's why he brings Heidegger's Dasein. Right, Dasein means being there. Right, so
it doesn't just go backwards though, because eternity connects
it goes both.
Right, correct. It attaches the past and the future to the.
And
it is most properly rooted in the present.
And he's saying that we need to face both presence, the past, and the future. This whole idea of this projection of this temporal understanding of our being, which is this universal unipolarity, he calls it, right? He says that each Dasein, each culture, has its own Dasein. Dasein is its own interpretation of time as such. That's what you kind of reflects someone's being, someone's
Why
Dasein.
Why do you think he just chooses to associate Heidegger's idea of Dasein as as being related to culture, ethnos, which is certainly not something that Heidegger did.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think, the being in the works being in time, a culture or ethnos's being is related to how they metabolize time, past, present, and future. Right. So it's different, uniquely different ways of appropriating one's being in terms of how they appropriate time, in a sense, which is abstract in a sense, because we think of time in a very scientific, rationalistic, sensible
Oh,
way.
I can see there a sense of urgency on empathy. Okay, so that like being resistant to liberalism as in terms of like the myth of progress would make sense of like why that becomes so important to him, particularly if you're relating it to how a people group experiences time. But I
And his
don't.
crit-
But
yeah.
the thing is though, that's still, it's like I don't understand the idea of making like the essential like subject of history a people group from a Christian perspective. That just doesn't seem to work to me.
Could we,
Yeah.
could we try to steel man Dugin's argument just for my sake?
Well, one thing I will say in his favor really quick is that Dugin does have like early on in the text, like he is very much, he does have the humility to say, this is my attempt at a fourth political theory. And he does invite other people into the project.
Yeah, it says it's
So-
open source.
Yeah,
there's no,
right.
there's no preconceived notion of it, and it might fail. He says it might
Right.
not even, the whole thing he's trying to fight unipolarity, which he says is just the progression of liberalism, and now in this monstrous neoliberalism, this global liberalism that is not exporting love, universal human rights per se. It's a simulacrum of these ideas of love and human rights. It's using that to spread
Right.
this tech, and it has to do with technology and what
Yeah, I have
technology does
I
to
have
a
no
people,
argument with his critique of liberalism or modernity
Yeah.
whatsoever. Like,
I-
I'm
Yeah, me
actually,
neither.
I think
he's
honestly,
a-
I do
he's a-
though.
Go,
Yeah.
okay, that I'd like to hear from you then, because
Yeah,
I mostly agreed with him there. I just thought
Right.
where he went with his own ideas, I thought was deeply problematic.
Yeah, so my issue is kind of simple on this one, and is less spiritually driven. I think that he, like, in his critique of Marxism, I think he's ignoring the fact that the reason why liberalism has been most successful is because it comports best with the market and capitalist economy. Right. And I think that, and in my own political thinking, just to be pretty clear, I think that economics is what drives politics, not the other way around. And so
Dugin would agree with you in terms of for liberalism. He says that's
For
exactly
liberalism,
the case.
yeah, but
Economics becomes the driving engine of it.
but it is. And so I think that the question to me also, like, and this isn't, he's not an economist, so I'm not holding him accountable for not hitting economic thinking with more depth when he's trying to tease out his fourth political theory. But I think that relationship between liberalism and capitalism and global capitalism at this point is the reason why liberalism maintains its ascendancy as a global system.
Right.
Even in some senses, like, we don't really have any Marxist states, even China, with, trying to say that it's somehow loosely communistic. It is still existing within the structures of the global capitalist system, and it's still being driven by the needs and demands of the market itself. And so, some of the reasons why liberalism appeals that way is because, in a sense, it comports so nicely with laws of like supply and demand, and the ability to generate demand through free choice or the appearance of free choice, these kinds of things. And so the at least the illusion that liberalism gives as the liberated individual comports incredibly well with a capitalist society, right? And so I think that some of what we have here is, in trying to attain to a political theory, which I'm less interested in as a Christian. I'm more interested in the kingdom. But in terms of political theory, I do think that that's an aspect that has to be understood, is that the reason why liberalism has succeeded so well is because it is completely interwoven with capitalism. And he does make those points. It's just that that's not really developed, and I don't think enough weight is given to the fact that this is the reason why, even within Russia, within their structure right now, is it kind of lends itself to more of an oligarchic state, because that's what works best within Russia's position within global capitalism, which is a precarious position, and part of the reason why he's so vehement in his critique of liberalism, and understandably so. But I think that what gets missed is, hey, a lot of this is also being driven by things that aren't immediately transparent to the political system, because in a lot of ways, capitalism drives the politics of liberalism.
Yeah, but don't you think that that's what's under fire right now is capitalism?
No, I think that capitalism is, I think it's in a disintegrating state, but I think it's as powerful as it's ever been.
Do you think he's essentially correct in saying that the political subject of liberalism is the individual? And is this conception of the individual as the proper political subject for liberalism connected to its parasitic involvement with this particular brand of destructive capitalism that has kind of become synonymous with it?
And this is me thinking on the fly here, and I don't know how well this connects. So I would say, like, no, the proper subject of liberalism is not the individual; it is the consumer.
Oh yeah, of course, but that
and so I think that
is completely manipulated and propagated.
Right, and so for me, that has
to. But isn't the individual as conceived, because like that atomized conception of the individual that we have within liberalism, how is that like that what could that be other than the consumer?
Yeah, and so I think that that's what the individual is in liberalism, is the consumer, right? Because all choice then basically boils down to, it's my personal utility, right? My decision, my economic decision making is what is advancing my own interests, right? And so, that's why I have a hard time with any Christian defenses of capitalism. I'm not saying that everything about capitalism is evil, right? I have to work, I have to pay rent, I got to, all the kinds of things. I have to exist within this system. I'm not interested in completely tearing it down because of what the costs would be on the other side of that. However, I think that at least maybe there was, a stronger sense of what liberalism was in its kind of early stages, especially developing within American democracy. But that really develops, in through the 19th century into the 20th century, where the individual and the consumer are one thing. And I think it's actually consumerism at the end of the day is destructive of the individual.
Right.
He would agree, and he actually speaks positively about liberalism prior to liberalism winning out in terms of the three political theories. When it didn't have communism essentially or fascism to fight against, and turned into this hyper technological consumerism where literally the consumer is consuming himself. And he says that the process to individuality, this hyper neoliberalism, has disentangled humans from first God. God is dead, right? Then any forms of religion that differentiated from this idea of God, and then from there, from nation state. And I can see this is a good critique, because we used to have America. We'd be proud of America, right? So we're taking out of all these collective categories that gave us our identity progressively. And he says the last category is human himself, and he says that's what's going on with gender ideology.
Right.
And his position is that this is all leading to AI and this technological singularity. That's the way that we're seeing gender insanity on TikTok, for example. That logic is going to continue to AI, where it's going to be like AI is, we're going to just continue to disentangle ourselves from categories where there's no categories left. And he says to be human will be called fascist in the future. To be human, it'll be called fascist in the future. And it makes sense. I don't know that far, but like,
right. Yeah. He also has the idea that the individual is being even like is breaking down to the point where now we have the individual, where like it becomes like the parts of the individual person that becoming the defining characteristics, which you can kind of see that in transgender ideology.
And he says that's going to continue. And his whole critique is based, again, on Heidegger's understanding of modernity as and framing as gestalt, which means that we presuppose, we assume, we see, we in the limiting choices that we have, it's already assumed how we see the world as a resource for us to appropriate, to use as energy. So we don't look at a waterfall as a beautiful thing in itself. We look at it as a resource to get electronic energy from. And he says that this logic, that's what's being exported with liberalism to all these different countries. That's what the national security state and the American project, that is what's is exporting, this empty simulacra of consumerism. That this is what he says, that eventually, that eats the culture from the inside. Right. Thomas Friedman said that if we had a McDonald's, his McDonald's theory, Arch's theory, that if you have countries that have McDonald's in them, they'll never go to war. Right. Yeah. It's this totalizing, complete unipolar vision that is overcoating the world. And he's gotten right. We see what's happening with the World Economic Forum, right? We see with Build Back Better and these technological theories that are supposed to solve all the problems. He's using that in a pretty clever way to saying we need to fight against that. And he's saying in his and I don't know, I don't see it in his ultimate affirming theory of multipolarity. I don't know, but I don't see an affirming something ethos to get behind.
And I think that's because
something that is missing, that is glaringly missing in the whole book, is any idea of orthodox ethos, any church fathers, any
specifically
Christian.
I will put my finger directly on it. It is the notion of the person as that is developed within Christian theology. And like within Russian tradition, like Bylosky, for example, that he's missing, because he proposes the collective is he accepts the collective as the proper political subject.
Yeah.
So he doesn't see this pathway that is neither the individual that is as posited by liberalism or the collective that he is suggesting in its place, but the person, which is a fundamentally relational concept. It is both. It is somewhere in between the collective identity and the individual identity, because you have an individual person, but that individual person exists in relation as part of a community, and that community helps to define what that person is, and vice versa.
Yeah, but this is a question. If he's trying to define a political theory, dare he frame it in a Christian way? Because if his idea is multipolarity, then everybody has to exercise their religious intuition and whatever. Like, he's fine with whatever they want to do, right? As far as I understand it.
Well,
he's okay with Islam and Buddhism. It's just as long as it stays within its own cultural geographic location.
Yeah, as opposed to what's being imported.
Yeah, to me that is that's completely untenable, right? And historically naive, right?
What is untenable?
His concept of multipolarity is a non-starter. Not because multipolarity in principle is impossible, but the idea that these cultures can retain their kind of enduring cultural legacy, it runs aground on history. Right. And again, this is where economics comes into it. How do cultures have concourse? Well, it's through trade, right? Anytime you have trade and you have goods and services moving across borders, which has been since the dawn of time, you have cultures interacting with each other and mutually developing as a result of those relationships that are being facilitated through trade. Right? It doesn't mean that's the only way, but that is a dominant way. And that is basically the globalist story for the last 500 years, has been this tremendous global explosion. Globalism is old, right? It's not new. And I think part of my problem with his concept of technology is I think that there's a kind of a Luddite kind of retreat away from transhumanism, however he's defining that. I have huge problems with what he says about gender, but I also come at that from a progressive angle, which I'll be in the minority in this group. However, let's just say on technology itself, Well, the prophetic witness talks about swords being beaten into plowshares and spears being beaten into pruning hooks. To me, what that signifies is a conciliatory relationship between man and the machine. That these tools are, it's not the tools themselves, but it's how they're being fashioned and how they're being used, that no longer are they being turned against us. And even from a position of like his points of contact with Russian sociology, like transhumanism is not even possible because we can't escape our humanity, because that's a divine humanity that's always already prior to.
Well, and if we did escape our humanity, it would literally be hell.
Yeah, but I don't want to say that the concerns are totally unfounded, but it's just like, no, I don't think transhumanism, although there's a push for it, I don't think it's even possible. So what we'll be doing is damaging ourselves and damaging our humanity. But so let's say we eventually are able to upload ourselves into virtual worlds and live these kind of quasi.
But don't you think it's right to critique even the ambition for it though, because of how destructive it is?
But then his critique, kind of my position is like, well, what spares your position from it's growing out of a Christian context with Christian concerns? What spares your critique from the same Antichrist kind of spirit that you're trying to guard against in your critique of the other theories? And I think it's because he's avoiding some of those, what you're talking about, James and Nate, is like, it seems like he appropriates tradition and the Christian spiritual legacy in ways that are useful for him, but not in a way that really reflects the deeper eschatological thinking of the fathers, let's say like a Gregory of Nyssa or Maximus the Confessor, or, go into Berdyaev. And so, like the whole legacy of,
although he quotes Bulgakov and Berdyaev.
I know, and so that's where I find him so mystifying. It's like, how?
But he's well versed in the fathers, right? I've seen him.
Absolutely.
Right. So
he's very erudite.
It's purposefully left out of here.
Yeah.
Absolutely, completely left out of here, which I find interesting. I don't know exactly
James,
what to make of it.
How would you explain that? Like, I mean, in terms of, because you brought that up, and I think it's a really valuable point. Like, what?
Yeah, I'd like to hear your answer to that
on that one. And so I'm wondering what your sense is there.
What's that? What point do you mean? So
how do we account for like his ability to make use of certain patristic and Christian elements, but then like in a sense it seems to be a feature of his thought, but then there's this gaping void, I feel like, in the middle where the substance of what they're talking about, it just seems to be sorely lacking, at least in my reading of him. And so I'm that's where I'm like, whoa, how is he using these sources and for what end?
I think he's using them after the onset of postmodernity, through postmodernity, in this void. The psychoanalytic types say that at the center of human being and consciousness is the void, is the negative, right? So in this void is where we're at with the logic of postmodernity. And he would say that we need to take the debris that has been flung off from postmodernity interacting with these old traditional metaphysical systems. And he says there's gold in that debris, and we need to find out of that debris and use that to build the fourth political theory. He says, there's a quote, he says, not only the highest supramental symbols of faith can be taken on board once again as a new shield, but so can those irrational aspects of cults, rites, and legends that have perplexed theologians of earlier ages. If we reject the idea of progress that is inherent in modernity, which we have seen has ended, then all that is ancient gains value and credibility for us simply by virtue of the fact that it's ancient. Ancient means good, and the more ancient, the better. And he says, of all creations, paradise is the most ancient one. This is kind of scary. The carriers of the fourth political theory must strive towards rediscovering it in the near future.
It's so interesting that you brought that up. I made a note on that passage. I'll go back to it, but I got to pull it up.
That wasn't the one I was looking for. It was 2 pages before. Hold on, let me drop one more in here. He says,
sure.
The fourth political theory is the amalgamation of a common project and arises from a common impulse to everything that was discarded, toppled, and humiliated during the course of constructing, quote, the society of the spectacle, constructing postmodernity. He says, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The philosopher Alexander Sikatsky rightly pointed out the significance of marginalia in the formation of a new philosophical age, suggesting the term metaphysics of debris as a metaphor. So it's not going to make sense. Like, just like postmodernism, like, you know, it's not going to make sense. We can't use the current categories that we have and make sense of the fourth political theory, because he says it's open and there's no sense making in it yet. And I'm not defending this position. I'm just saying from my reading of kind of what his response would be in a sense. And I don't know if so I've been watching Jonathan's videos, and something came that kind of emerged to me watching his talk on Enoch, when he talks about Jubal and Tubal Cain, right? So Jubal is works with musical instruments, right? So chaos, right? To bring in change, right? And Jubal works with livestock and builds tents. So it's land dwelling. So this made me think of Dugin's understanding of this thalassocracy, right? The seafaring society, the Atlanticist, what he says the West is, and then the Tellurocracy, which he says landlocked society. And it made me think of the biblical reference to the land and the sea, right? And now the sea in its mercantilism, right, through this consumerism, through this global consumerism, is exporting this ethic that is the seafarer against, he's saying, the land dwellers, which he's for, right? So this dichotomy, kind of stood out to me. I don't know if that makes sense. And then I was thinking, where does Tubal Cain fit into this, right? The creators of the technology and the tools used in here. So I don't know if that makes sense at all.
What's really interesting in my first reading of fourth political theory was about 5 years ago, and I mean, you don't know a ton about me, but I'm very apocalyptic in my outlook. I think that's where we are in history, like just nakedly. I think that either the fourth political theory is the kingdom or we're all doomed. Mm-hmm. That's my position. But in bringing that analogy and the kind of the seafaring and the landfaring, we get that imagery in Revelation, right? We get the beast that emerges from the sea, and we get the beast that emerges from the earth, both of which are Antichrist. And they're in their unique iterations. And I mean, I think that even plays into kind of the deeper concepts of the war between the beast and the whore of Babylon. And we get into these two systems are competing systems that are antagonistic, but mutually dependent in this kind of mimetic rivalry, to use like a Girardian term, that are mutually dependent in order to kind of build the world system as it is. And I think that is the dynamic throughout history. And you see the difference between the mercantilist societies on the periphery and the kind of more landlocked societies that are in the center. That's a dynamic that we've seen throughout history. And Dugin's really good in pointing that out. That's actually maybe one of the strengths of his writing is to make that kind of hidden thing apparent. But what protects his system from just being that beast that arises, the behemoth?
Right. Right. And the Atlantis system to me is more represented by the image of the horror than it is the beast. And actually what Dugin kind of represents is the beast rising up against the horror.
And eventually takes the horror out, right, before it completely takes over. Is that correct?
But what's interesting, I've been reading Charles Upton's critique of Dugin after I read Fourth Political Theory, and then I wanted to read something that was critical from a perspective that was not just liberalism. So Upton tries to critique Dugin from a traditionalist point of view, from within the traditionalist school. And one of the things he suggests is that what Dugin is actually doing is playing into the theme of the war of Gog and Magog, which is like a distraction from the actual true eschatological conflict. So what do you guys think of that idea?
Yeah, and I think that was even when I'd written that apocalyptic novel was at least teasing out some of those themes, right? Is you do have in the book of Revelation, you have two beasts, and they are at war with two witnesses. And I think I look at these as universals, right? That the church is a stand-in for the witnessing community and the testimony is established by 2 or 3 witnesses, right? And so they are outside the city gates where the Lord was crucified. In a sense, that is the witnessing community bearing testimony through time to the work of Christ in time.
I was thinking today about that word witness, and and martyr meaning witness.
Yep.
And how like that idea of witness is related to the idea of like just the kind of like pure consciousness.
Right. And
like there's a direct association with that pure witness and divinity itself.
Right. And it's also the means by which Satan is overcome. So
Right.
In Revelation 12, how do they overcome Satan? They overcome him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, right? And so the task of the Christian community is not developing a political theory. There is already a polity that we belong to. It's the kingdom of the heavens, right? And this is what Jesus comes to instruct us about.
Well, that's the song I'm singing all the time, but I'm glad to hear someone else sing it.
I'm less impressed, but I understand the need for those political theories. But I think that witness through time puts you in direct conflict with both the Leviathan and Behemoth, right? And so, because those 2 power centers, and they're actually at the foot of the cross, the same power centers. If you look, there's a remarkable parallels between Revelation 11 and the crucifixion scene in John, right? There are 2 witnesses present. There's John. Peter drops out. So who's the other witness? It's the readers. It's the witnessing community that is drawn into it. They are at the foot of the cross with the beloved disciple, right? Is they're drawn into that same drama, bearing witness to what's happening there. And so from a perspective of someone who has a very apocalyptic outlook, my problem with Dugin is not that he is at some levels, I think, making a very admirable effort to identify very real problems. I disagree with him on multiple levels. But as a Christian, I find it to be somewhat irrelevant to the Christian task, which to me is just bound up in testimony.
Well, I mean, let's look at how the 4th political theory is playing out in practice as Dugin has laid it out. And we can see how it's playing out in practice in real time right now. And it's nothing that any Christian would want to associate themselves with, which is the murder of Christians by other Christians.
Let me read to your point here what he says at the end of chapter 12, the 4th political practice in terms of this eschatological. And I share your apocalyptic kind of sensibility of where we're at. And another aside, I've been reading Dugin, intensely for the last couple of weeks, and it's spiritually draining. Mm-hmm. Like I have to stop. I have acid reflux. Like I feel physical and spiritually drained because I don't know what it is. I have to step away and not read it for a bit. So it's really strange. And I share your critique of his positive solution here, especially in its political aspects. He says here at the end of the chapter 12, he says, the end times and the eschatological meaning of politics will not realize themselves on their own. We will wait for the end in vain. The end will never come if we wait for it, and it will never come if we do not. This is essential because history, time, and reality have special strategies to avoid Judgment Day, or rather, they have special strategies of a revisionary maneuver that will create the impression that everyone has come to a realization and understanding. This is a huge arsenal of Heidegger's eternal not yet. If the 4th political practice is not able to realize the end of times, then it would be invalid. The end of days should come, but it will not come by itself. This is a task. It is not a certainty. It is an active metaphysics. It is a practice, and it can be a potential and rational solution of the enigmatic layers that are discovered while talking about the 4th political practice.
So let me ask a question then. Is he saying that it is the job of the 4th political theory to bring the end of time into being?
Something like that. He's saying it's not the job. It's not the job to bring it into being. He says actually, yes, it is. But he's saying that necessarily can't be the task of a people. But he says that's what needs to be done, or we'll continue running into the simulation of the end, and people will think it's the end, but it's this but not yet.
Well, and how does that comport? So, James, are you familiar with Berdyaev at all?
I just wanted to ask one more question.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So, okay, wait, I lost my train of thought now. okay, maybe Paul can help me with this one. So the Bible does talk about all throughout and in Revelation, nations and people and tongues, right?
Yep. Yep.
And the judgment of nations and peoples and tongues.
Yep.
The necessity of nations and peoples and tongues.
Yep.
And so like I'm just listening and thinking about these things. Like when you were talking about the Leviathan and you know, the little beast with the little horns and stuff. Steiner talks about those in terms of the Aramonic and the Luciferic, right? And when we went through Bach's book, there's an angel that straddles the sea and the dry land in Revelation. And Bach makes the point that the idea there is not to destroy the Aramonic and the Luciferic, but to bridle them.
Right, because the essentially it's kind of like the idea of the like the middle path, where
Right,
like
and
that
they are
both
representative
the Luciferic and the Aramonic, like the Luciferic is like sort of like like an arrogant ascent, and the Aramonic is like just an absolute descent, and that basically I think you can't connect, and what's in the middle is connected to presence.
Well, maybe like a good image to say like the healthy connection between ascent and descent is like Jacob's ladder.
Right.
Yeah, but I have always been intrigued by the idea of them being bridled, because they also represent the passions. And I think the way that Bach says it, the Luciferic delivers up to the Aramonic, right? The Luciferic delivers up to the machine.
So
Passions deliver up to the machine, which I see that. Like I can see that pattern, right? And that is something that Christians do or try to do, is to control the passions, right? So that they don't get delivered up to some kind of totalizing system, which is always described as the number of a man, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that number too, Sherry, just to jump in, like 666, if you're looking in the imagery of Revelation, just kind of taking a kind of a perusal of that image, I kind of reject the idea that it's a reference to Nero, right? I think that what you have there is a number of false theosis, right? Because you have this interplay of these sevens and actually triplets of sevens throughout the book of Revelation that are referred to in terms of the relationship of Father, Son, and Spirit, and the true path to theosis. And then you have this degraded theosis, this false trinity, and this false triad of Satan and the two beasts represented in that 666, which is the human tendency to think that we can direct our own theosis, which I think the technological problem feeds into, that Dugin is recognizing.
This is why it's interesting to me that
well, and that would be the Luciferic pole of evil too. That's like that you can, you know, attain the throne of the Most High on your own terms, essentially.
Well, I read somewhere recently that it was interesting that the number 6 in 666 refers to the 6th day of creation, right? The creation of man. And it's man's hubris, right? There is no Sabbath, there is no 7th day. And it's creating a system absent the transcendent and the Sabbath, right? And that's this totalizing, logical, rational system that we're going to make, you know, the Tower of Babel, essentially. And I've never heard it put that way, and it makes sense in this context.
I just wanted to share this really quick in the context of like Dugin's talking about like the retrieving of the idea of paradise and sort of the eschatology of the fourth political theory. This is from Upton's book, Dugin Against Dugin. Here, Dugin exhibits one of the most common misunderstandings of tradition and traditionalist doctrine, the idea that tradition worships the past. Tradition does not worship the past, it worships God. And God is not only in the past, he is much more truly in the present, that is, in eternity. If he were not in eternity, he could not approach us, as he is doing as we read these words from the direction of the future. If traditionalism grants precedence to the past, It is not only because the past is over and done with and fixed and therefore capable of being possessed, but simply because most people in past ages, according to the laws of the Manvantara, were more in touch with eternity than most people are today. Yet our own door to eternity is neither the past nor the future, but the present moment. Consequently, when Alexander Dugin says, of all creations, paradise is the most ancient one, the carriers of the fourth political theory must stride toward rediscovering it in the near future. It is clear that he has no understanding of the intrinsic solidarity between what is ancient and what is here and now, that the only door to paradise is this present moment, not to mention the rudimentary piece of spiritual guidance that advises us not to seek our paradise in the past, but to hope with faith that it lies here in our own future. God the Father in the book of Malachi says, I am Jehovah, I have not changed. Jesus Christ in the book of the Apocalypse says, behold, I make all things new. Furthermore, speaking in Christian terms, it is not the Son one of one substance, homoousion, with the Father. But if the fourth political theory must strive toward rediscovering paradise in the near future instead of realizing paradise now in the spiritual heart, which no political theory can do, thus making the heart ready for a paradisical future, that future will never come. This is the illusion, the obsession, and the bitter irony suffered by the Titans and the Asuras and the Jotun in their perpetual and eternally unconsummated struggle to take heaven by storm. If we recognize this truth and can live with it and live into it without greed or fear, then all the materia of the eternal form of paradise needs to make a living body for itself will flow toward it spontaneously from both the past and the future. The future can never be reached, it can only arrive. The past can never be dredged up from the heaviness of matter by power and labor and struggle. It can only be loved. Only love can transform the past from a dead weight into a living potential.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Paul, I'm curious, like, as we're kind of, I don't want to shift gear because I think that I love Upton's critique. Like, you know, he comes from it from like this as a Sufi Muslim. But I'm very curious as to what a CRC pastor thinks of all of this as you've been kind of sitting and taking all of this in.
Oh, poor Sherry. You guys talk over Sherry so much.
We did. It's one of our great sins.
Gotta listen to Sherry. Sherry's got a lot of wisdom.
Agreed.
I find it fascinating. I find many of the ongoing struggles. So I haven't made back up. Stop talking until my mind has caught up. I've been wanting to really dig into a bunch of Peugeot's recent talks. His talk with James Lindsay and Benjamin Boyce, his talk with Paul Kingsnorth, is obviously his talk with Brett Weinstein. And I thought, probably my favorite of all the videos was his discussion of Enoch. I thought that very much illuminated a lot of where Peugeot is at.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's tremendously difficult to. So the second two, communism, fascism, very much follow on liberalism. They're all children of the Enlightenment.
Yep.
And they're all humanist in the sense that the action, the movement is coming from humanity, whether that's sort of a communal, such as class movement in Marx, whether that's sort of a naturalism that's in at least Nazi ideology and Nazi fascist, figuring out the relationship between those two. Of course, liberalism comes out of a deep skepticism, and there's, I think, a real, to borrow from what Nate and Sherry were talking about, the Luciferian, in that we are striving up to the heavens, and I think all of you have critiqued the some of the avaricious humanism in all of these political ideologies. I was thinking, again, I just haven't had time to make videos, but I actually wanted to begin my critique of some of Peugeot's videos with this major piece put out by Jonathan Haidt in The Atlantic on he's sort of it's Haidt doing his own thing. But if you take Haidt's piece and you take, say, Paul Kingsnorth's, what he's been developing, the idea of the blob or the machine, this world system that is it's totalizing, and it's so built into the systems we inhabit that we can no longer see it.
Yeah.
The tyrannical humanism of all of these systems that can't see beyond itself, that very much connects in some ways with Brett Weinstein's vision of, beneath a lot of what Brett talks about, there's a deep tyranny of we must save ourselves via, and he's sort of all over the map in terms of how that would happen. I love the idea of critiquing these three systems, but what they all tend to have in common, maybe not at least the Nazi system as much, because that's sort of a taking humanity, taking its hands off nature, but it's a very dark, cruel nature that then ascends, and that's almost ceding the place to the beasts. Whereas, the vision of the coming of the kingdom that you find in the apocalypse is one of divine intervention and divine rescue, and a violent putting away of our own self-destructive avarice by which we consume the world. And I find that in the apocalypse, the posture of the faithful humanity is one under the altar in many respects, of crying out to the Lord, "How long, O Lord, how long?" And then, of course, our participation in this new heavens and a new earth, but it is finally a gift that comes from above. And, I know that there is fear of somehow losing our place in that coming drama, but I don't think it will be lost. So, watching these, conceptualizing these beasts, let's say, you can look at, say, the beast of liberalism and the beast of communism and the beast of fascism. The Ancient of Days in Daniel 7 sets up his thrones, and it's like whoosh, the beasts are, begin to be subdued, and then, of course, the Son of Man comes and is given an eternal kingdom. And that is the process that is underway, even through the consumption, the consuming, and the crushing and the devouring that the beasts are doing. And so I think a proper apocalyptic Christian posture is, of course, faithfulness in the midst of this cruciform drama, with the optimism that we do not, it's clear in the book of Revelation, we do not know the plan or the path that the Lord is taking, but the posture of the Christian is trust and faithful participation in Christ through these passages. And so I tend to think that a Christian political Christian political conceptualization sort of has to be embedded in that vision, that and there's clearly elements of Christian DNA in liberalism. There's clearly elements of Christian DNA in Marxism. If you listen to Tom Holland's and Dominic Sandbrook's treatment of both Marxism and fascism in their podcast, there's almost nothing that Christianity hasn't altered and infused in our world today. Yet almost all of these humanistic ambitions are warped by us in the greed, and I think, as Sherry said, well, in the desires that we have. I mean, consumerism is sort of desire turned into a god. And I like, Nate, where he was, started out initially talking about, the person, where what we are looking for is in fact this much more relational eschatology of our communion with our God and our communion with each other, and I think our communion then with the rest, with our sister, as Lewis calls nature. So those are the ideas that have been going through my mind listening to you guys
Well,
talk.
I think liberalism in its Christian roots, I think that's the subject that it started out with, like the Christian idea of the person, as I was trying to express it earlier. This is what it begins with, and it ends up with this individual that exists, really where consumption is the only end, because you take God out of the equation.
Yeah, I think that was well put, Paul. Thank you. The way that, I don't see a political Christian answer, but I think that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, right?
Yeah.
So I think what we'll experience as the apocalypse, or these political machinations, are necessary to get to this point, because it's already there. So it's like things are disintegrating and breaking down. That is our view from this side of whatever is coming. I kind of take solace in that. And I think that Dugin, he's playing on these real concerns that real Christians have and should have, I'd say. And with this, Jonathan talks about this disincarnation, or this de-incarnation that we're seeing. And with social media and all of the recent technological advancements, we've seen them be so detrimental to the very thing that's sacred to Christians, is that, God has already been relieved of his duties politically, but now the person, the dignity of the person, and he's playing on that fear, or that concern. My wife is a critical care nurse in the ICU, and to have, when coronavirus was coming, you couldn't be with your loved ones while they were dying. It has happened in countless numbers of ways. Maybe you'd get an iPad, but the idea that we're just statistical data points, that if we just don't have this person next to this person has coronavirus, we're going to have less spread. Therefore, we need to go with that statistical analysis rather than a human being with another human being that's dying, a family member. Like that, more of that is slipping away in a sense. And I think he's playing on that fear. And I think that's what kind of draws me into, because he's pointing out to these things that are like, ugh.
Yeah, I definitely think people should read him.
Yeah.
His critique of liberalism is very good, and it's very on point. And
neo hyper liberalism, because
right.
What liberalism has become after World War II, and there was no
what he sees as the political force that is resisting Russian ambition, in the contemporary, which is because he does care about the political situation, so yeah, in terms of what he's addressing.
Yeah, he brings in Carl Schmitt a lot, who I just started reading a little bit. And as we've seen the last 5 years, the politicization of everything, I started reflecting, like, what is that? What is it when everything's become politicized? What did they talk? What are we talking about when we say that? And Carl Schmitt had a beautiful, easy, straight and clear definition of what is the political. He says, the political is that which determines the friend-enemy distinction.
Yeah.
Period. Either on the individual level or the collective level. And hearing that, I'm like, oh my God, that's what's been, it's been taken to, if someone's not vaccinated, they're the enemy. It creates these groups, and what the creation in the group is inferred between this friend-enemy distinction. And the idea that Christ came not to be a political, overthrower and usurper for the Jewish people. He came to elucidate and destroy that distinction.
Right, which
between
means that
friend and enemy.
Which means
that doesn't mean that we're all homogenized. You're still going to have groups of people or people you disagree with, what is the relationship like with
Yeah,
an
he
enemy
resets-
that you love that is not
Yeah,
political?
doesn't mean your enemy isn't your enemy, but it means your relationship with your enemy has been radically reoriented.
Yeah.
And I think that like and one of the things I appreciate, Nate, about what you've done.
I don't think you can politically love your enemies, though.
Well, and I think, and even I see this in Paul's communities as well, and I'm kind of adjacent in my own weird way. I mean, guys, I'm out there, and I know that, so I'm cool with it.
All right.
But what has been important in the relationships and like that I've seen develop here is that, yeah, I'm off the charts progressive. I want to find the very edge of the envelope, and then I want to push past it and find the next envelope. That's just me. But because we don't relate to each other in political terms, we relate to each other within a shared ideology of love, not ideology, I guess it's a shared ethic of love and a shared presence of love that enables us to, and we're very different, obviously. Like discussions we have with Sherry, with Nate, and with a lot of other interlocutors here. Like I'm definitely I'm out there at times, but it's never out of a context of my perspectives get heard. I get to express these things freely, and I know that I'm loved. And one of the things that I wanted to, I hope I'm not stealing the ball too much, but I actually want to pass it to Sherry, not only because you said something, Paul, but because Sherry has a really important perspective that I think is important. And it has to do with like just that. One of the things that you talk about a lot, Sherry, is the importance of non-judgment. Now, sometimes I'll push back on you on that, but I think like the core concept that you bring in, even the discussions we've been having in our private discussions about Dugin is important. I was hoping maybe you could just develop like, how should we judge this or not? And I'm curious to see what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about, everything that's been discussed. One of them is that, if Rome is burning, we're Roman. Okay, just so you know. and that's not gonna look good. It's not gonna feel good, and it's gonna be really confusing, right? To be the Rome in Rome while it's burning. And a lot of the critique that I hear about Dugin is essentially the same critique that he has of the West, right? And so I'm kind of like, okay, so like Luke's constantly saying, it all depends on where you're standing, and I tend to be very empathetic. And so I can always put myself in other people's shoes. And that's sometimes a positive thing, and sometimes it's really negative for me. Because sometimes I can have misplaced compassion, right? But I like Paul said, and I believe the Bible talks about nations and peoples and tongues. And I don't think that's going to go away. I think the attempt to make that go away is Antichrist, because God made us as nations and peoples and tongues. And God uses the nations to judge other nations. He's done it in the past, and I don't expect him to quit anytime soon. And the fact, and so these are just my random thoughts, okay? And then the fact that Christianity brought liberalism into the world. Like Paul said, it also brought fascism into the world, and communism into the world, so to speak, right? I wouldn't blame that on Christ. I would blame that on humanity, because we just always get everything wrong, right? And in our attempt to make it good, there it is. Here comes the judgment, the non-judgment. We oftentimes make it really bad. And so like the Chinese farmer, right, says, when everybody comes running because his horse ran away and says, oh, that's terrible. He says, well, maybe. And then the horse comes back with 7 wild horses, and everybody says, well, that's great. And he says, well, maybe. And then his son breaking one of the horses falls off and breaks his leg, and all the neighbors run over and say, well, that's terrible. And he says, well, maybe. And then the conscriptors show up, right? And they leave his son behind because he has a broken leg, and everyone says, well, that's wonderful. And he says, well, maybe. Like, we just don't know, right? And like I said before you started recording, I think it's important to worry about how we talk about these things, not necessarily the content, you know, but the art. And I mean that in the German way, like the actual art is, you know, the formulation of something, but also as an art. Because I think that's what Christians are supposed to have. They are supposed to exercise the art of loving speech and loving interaction and loving in a non-judgmental way. And when we do that, we defer to God, in my opinion, because he's ultimately in control. So there, said my piece.
Mhm. So I was the thing that, and I get, James, I'm kind of like you. I find Dugin to be spiritually exhausting. So I found myself last night, I was like, what? I didn't know how to put language to it. So I was in Matthew chapter 13. I'm just reading through the parables, and I actually brought the book. I'll quote a couple quick paragraphs out of it. But the parable of the dragnet, I think, is illustrative of something that Dugin's thought really struggles with. And it's very interesting that, you know, we tend to think that net is dragging everything up, but we tend to think of it as dragging fish up. It's just dragging everything up. It's a dragnet. Everything gets included in the kingdom, and its Catholicity, and that comes out of Robert Capen's writings on the parables that I'll quote in just a minute. But the kingdom is indiscriminate in what it gathers, and what is useful to the kingdom will always remain, and what is not useful to the kingdom just passes away. And that seems to be the final judgment. And I think that, you know, the critique could easily come back my way here too. So I'm aware of the limitations that I have in even presenting this. But with Dugin, I think that where he sees fragmentation in postmodernity, where he sees fragmentation in liberalism and in all of these different, all these different systems, I see maybe from the perspective of the kingdom that is like that mustard seed that grows into the tree whose branches stretch out into heaven, is its fractalization, right? It's variations on a theme. And at the upper reaches of that organism, right, it's going to look different than what the seed looked like. It's going to look different than what the main trunk looks like and what the main branches look like, but it's all of the same piece. And so to me, the issue is not, liberalism is not, to me, something that needs to be defeated one way or the other. It's going to take care of itself. Capitalism will do the same thing. Communism kind of did the same thing. It collapsed under its own weight. Fascism was a little bit different in terms of how that was defeated, but a lot of these systems just, they collapse under their own imperatives. They don't withstand, what is that? Edward Gibbon's take on Rome, that it falls through the injuries of time, right? The injuries of time are going to wear all of these systems down, and the kingdom exceeds that. And so to me, the question is not, I don't need to be against liberalism or progressivism or communism or, and that's where Sherry, I was asking you a leading question and I was cheating, and I'm sorry. But I think that your main point there is something that is animated in that Christian sense of what the kingdom is about. It operates on a different paradigm. And I think that is my fundamental concern as a Christian who's reading Dugin, is right. I don't see this as a viable option for Christians to move forward in a way that advances the interests of God's kingdom. It may advance the interests of Russia. It may advance the interests of certain kinds of conservatives or people attracted to Heidegger's thinking, those kinds of things. But I don't see that they're there. And so that's where like my main concern is. And I realize that maybe is a little bit of a naive critique, but I think that
No.
it's on the right track.
I think you're very much. He actually defines. He actually says what divides us is what unite, or what we are against is what unites us. So he's actually seeking the unity through what the fourth political theory is opposed to, for the
Yeah.
sake of political convenience. So he's actually operating from exactly the opposite principle that you're suggesting.
Yeah, and I would agree with your feelings of his project there. So he wrote this in 2009, 10, 11. I think it was published in English. And he really was, all out against America, Americans, and the West, right? He's since updated it because he says there's a political awakening that happened during Trumpism, where this same thing that the Islamists, the Russians intuited about what America has become and is exporting was felt in the center of the country, in the center of America. So he says that this awakening, he has a book called The Great Awakening versus the Great Reset. He says the Great Awakening will happen in America, right? But it's going to happen in concert with the others awakening cultures that have seen what America has become and the logic of the Antichrist from a Christian perspective. He brings in Dajjal, which is the Antichrist in the Muslim perspective. He brings in the Kali Yuga. So it's very eschatological. And he brings in all these eschatological symptoms. He even brings in the Jewish Antichrist. I forgot what it's entitled there. And he's saying that now that these systems are moving globally, the system is moving to a global, it's becoming obvious what this globalist system is for. He's saying that can awaken this religious intuition of the end times, of the Antichrist in each specific tradition, in a sense. So he's trying to say that's what's emerging here, and he's trying to kind of leverage this eschatological thinking from each specific individual culture, and he breaks down the world into these kind of meridians. So you have the West, which will be America, will be the superpower in the West. You'll have Canada and South America. So that's one block. Then you have Russia and Africa and India, and you have Europe in the middle. So America is the center, and then Europe he even puts in the center, which mitigates between Russia and the South. And then you have Asia in the center being China. So he's saying these are individual poles, right? If we're against this unipolarity, this homogeneity, this technical homogeneity that we're seeing from this technological system that's being exported, they're going to have to awaken the specific being of each individual, culture that's an ontological reality. Like there's something there that we've forgotten how to observe, in a sense. So there's something real that's there that's going to be woken up. And I think I'm with you. I don't see how that happens, right? I don't see that in any kind of thread that weaves it all together, other than his continuously pointing
because
to
it's not. I mean,
Antichrist.
it's not true. I mean, it's just fundamentally, it's a false notion of like of what a human being is. Like, and
Well, you've had you have the Chinese people thousands of years, right? They have Confucianism, Taoism. There's something there that there's an ancient Chinese kind of ethic that's been covered over by late stage capitalism and this hyper liberalization. The same thing with the Iranian people. And I'm not saying I agree with this. I think there is a specific Iranian ethos culture, right? That again,
but not ontology though.
Well, yeah, I know. I wouldn't say ontology, and I don't think he uses
He
specifically.
does. He actually does say ontology. Yeah, he does say
Yeah.
ontology, which I'm like,
Well,
no.
Well, he's
I'm
going.
gonna run, guys.
Thanks for joining
So-
us.
All right,
Paul.
thanks,
We
Paul.
Enjoy the
appreciate it.
conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that.
Well, I
Yeah.
wonder. I just have this other thought. Shoot. Okay, so you were talking about this ontology. So ontology is being, right?
Mm-hmm.
The logos of being.
Right. Okay, scrap that. I woke up this morning and the first thing that came into my head was when Jesus said to Peter, who am I? And Peter said, you're the Christ. And then Jesus said, well, flesh and blood has not revealed that to you. And then he said, I'm going to Jerusalem. And Peter said, be it far from thee. Right? And because he knew what would happen. And Jesus said, get thee behind me, Satan. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, maybe he was actually concerned. Like Peter, right? Maybe Satan was actually concerned. And we touched on this briefly in a post conversation, Nate. Concerned about Christ's welfare, right? No, don't go to Jerusalem. You're going to die, right? And that's what Peter said. And then Jesus said, well, no. Then he called him Satan at that moment. And it's a kind of, dare I say, weaponized compassion, right? It is, in a sense, because, or misplaced compassion. And how did I want to tie that in now? I was thinking about it earlier. I guess it just goes to this whole idea that sometimes these ends are achieved through violence, through pain and suffering, right? And to avoid or to think that should be avoided, I just don't know how rational that is from a spiritual point of view.
Well, I think Sherry, I really agree with you here, and I think it's an important. But there is a distinction that I think we can make is I do not know if the apocalyptic violence that's looming heavily on the horizon is something that can be stopped. I really don't at this point. I think that in a sense that cake might be baked, or we're just getting ready to take it out of the oven, right?
Like, I'm not advocating for violence.
Yeah, no, and I know that, but I think that the question then becomes, okay, if that is kind of what we're staring down, what changes for the Christian? Well, as it turns out, nothing changes.
Yeah,
We
but
go to the cross with Jesus, the same,
Right.
we're
Yeah.
called to the cross, and we're called to bear witness from there. And it's like, and we don't have to get super cute about, like, do we need to come up with a political theory? Do we need to hasten the day? I find that Dugin, sometimes he sounds like those dispensationalists that want to build a third temple.
Yeah,
in
which is
Jerusalem.
exactly what I was thinking. Like when you were
Yeah.
Right.
like,
He
what's
says,
the difference between Dugin and the dispensationalists? And they have swayed governments. They've lobbied.
he said Russia is going to be the third Rome, right? But he, and I think this is part of the reason why, we might feel spiritually drained reading. He uses chaos magic.
Mhm.
He comes from that background, so he understands how words, are like spells.
Yeah,
with
and he
people.
thinks
I
of
feel
Crowley
it reading
favorably
him.
too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So he's he takes yes to everything, right? To find the debris and then use it, but he doesn't say specifically to stitch. I'm trying to. Sounds like I'm trying to defend him, which I am in terms of your critique, right? But I share your impulse. I'm just
Yeah.
trying to, from what I've read, to see what maybe from reading what I would say his response would be. But I don't agree with it, and I agree
Right.
with more with this. And I'm very apocalyptic in my thinking. I think it's just observing what's going on. And I think for me, the trust part gets hard when I think of my children, my 3 young children in the world, and I'm like, that's where I struggle. Right. And it's like, for what's coming. And I just try to keep them in the church. I got them back in the church and understanding kind of these important truths that we're elucidating here, and this trust and this non-judgment and this kind of observing. That's hard. That's very hard.
Well, I mean, I'm all on board as well. Like I don't put my faith in any political theories. I'm not really political. And if anything is coming out of someone's head and then their mouth, I'm more suspicious of it than probably I should be most of the time, but there is a sort of, I guess for me, there is a sort of determinism to the apocalypse, like you were saying, Jed, right?
Mhm.
Where it's just going to happen. But what I find kind of interesting is that a lot of us are complaining about the state of Christianity and how it needs to die. And I actually don't see any other solution than this.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, well, and I think, and it goes kind of into some of the things that come out of our readings in Bach, right? It is the new song of the 144,000
Yeah.
that brings about the new creation, and you know, I mean, James, I'm kind of, I follow Bulgakov and his kind of his millenarian chiliastic thought. Like, I think there is a kind of millennium awaiting us, that is, you know, maybe not as literal as like the dispensationalists might think, but I think Bulgakov is very interesting in that respect. Is there is an earthly, you know, the end of the age is not the end of the world.
Mhm.
Right. And there is something that comes after whatever history is after. It's hard to, that's very difficult for any of us to discern. But it's a kingdom that's shaped by and rooted in what Christ really came to teach us. And it's really rooted in the scriptures themselves.
I mean, early Christianity came as a result of political upheaval and
Oh, yeah.
violent persecution. And they lived together in parallel societies, right?
Across ethnic divides.
Across ethnic divide, right? So it's a Sobernost, right?
So there's no rejection. There's no Christian basis for rejecting like the idea of a universal humanity. You just can't do it like that. Christ is, I mean,
But what I'm
ultimately Christ is the form of man.
But it's not a universal political identity.
No,
No.
it's a non-political identity.
Yeah,
Correct.
that's-
It's explicitly non-political identity, which is why I'm a Christian anarchist.
Yeah.
and
I
so,
hear ya.
so, like the way I see it is that these things are forged in fire. Okay,
Mhm.
they are, and so, I mean, I don't know. I'm really big on rejoice in the Lord always, and again, I say rejoice. You know, when the heat is coming at me, I'm like, okay, this is going to make me a better person, right? This is going to make and this is another thing that I think of often, is that the bride is being prepared. The bride isn't ready to go. She's being prepared, right? And so that's just going to come in, you know, as a universalist, this is what hell is.
So
right?
I want to,
And so if we have moments, if we have apocalypse happening, little apocalypses happening every day in our lives, and little hells, right? Then there's also going to be big ones, and they're all going to do the same work, don't you think?
Mhm.
right.
It's easier to reflect on that than when you're going through it, to have that mindset, to be mindful like that. I find that important to do. And I
Yeah.
think that you can gauge kind of your spiritual progression to be able to kind of do that, to not judge when things are going kind of haywire, because that will happen, and I think it will increase. But yeah, I would agree with you.
Well, I think it's a tremendous task in front of us in this kind of time, and it is really a difficult task, even down at a personal level, is for us to not lose our minds,
Hmm.
right?
Well, I just look forward to the Sobernost.
Right, and
I look forward
yeah,
to it.
yeah,
Community.
and well, I think it comes from building resilient communities of mutual support, of people you can count on. Doesn't mean you have to be ideologically on the same page, but it means if you need to go next door to get some eggs because you're out, you got somebody you know you can go to and can help,
Right.
and that
Well,
you are
I'm-
willing to help when you're in a position to do so. And like Revelation again, this calls for patient endurance.
Mhm.
You know, and that's, I think, the times that are in front of us, and my concern with Dugin in terms of especially his relationship to certain iterations of orthodoxy and within certain Christian circles, is that Christians are enamored of certain things he has to say, and that kind of that Crowleyan sense of, like, he definitely is a magician in his ability to kind of shift into, he's like this wax nose. It's what shape does he take? Well, it's what shape, whatever he needs, right?
Mhm.
Yep.
It's like, what is the that's there that for the Christian, like, can we hold on to? And I find that is the more valuable question to be asking than, like, is his critical statements on liberalism, are those helpful? Yeah, they're actually, he has some very insightful things to say. but I don't know if it really helps do anything except for kind of seed more entropy into the system and more chaos into the system, which, the end result is violence. And I think that it's like, okay, that we may not be able to avoid it, but I don't want to participate in that.
or accelerate it.
Well, I think
Yeah.
those critiques are important, like for Christians in America to hear, though, because there's that kind of a tendency to fall into this sort of like cultural, like bourgeois Christianity that like is okay with everything liberalism does, and so those critiques need to be heard.
I
Mm.
think it's also refreshing in a sense to people because they sense it happening anyways, right?
Mhm.
They can feel it falling apart, and that's kind of terrifying. But to actually hear it formulated, and like I didn't read the whole book or anything. I listened to a few chapters online and stuff. It's refreshing. It's like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy, right? I'm not crazy. It is falling
Mhm.
apart.
Yeah.
And
I feel like he's like Adam pointing to Eve about the problem, about the sin.
Yeah.
I feel like he's that more than a Christ, embodying any kind of the work of Christ. He's embodying the position of Adam when the fall was commencing. Because I was thinking, this idea of the subject object, we need to get back to the root. He has this idea of radical subjectivity, like radical in the root. We need to get to the root. I think of that as the tree prior to eating the fruit, right?
Mm.
That distinguished subject from object, that distinguished self-consciousness, right? So I see it like, so it's the shape-shifting conceptual framework that he uses. Oh, that's kind of a good, it's kind of an interesting notion to experiment with, but then it's,
But we can't actually get back to that place, though. That's the problem.
yeah, that is.
Well, that's on the other side of that's the underside of the apocalypse, right? The kingdom
Right.
of heaven was Adam and
Right.
Eve's
I think
ultimate.
that's such an interesting point, James, because I think that the story of Eden, I think, is perennially relevant to our situation, right? And I think there's a way of reading that is the fundamental fractures that exist in human consciousness, right? We chose the degraded and false duality of good and evil. There is duality in the garden. It's male and female, masculine and feminine, that are imaging forth God. And the first movement of consciousness is not knowledge, it is love. And Adam and Eve had perfect access to total communion with God and the created realm in that tree of life.
Mhm.
But they chose a different path, right? And so we're always leaning into our sense-making abilities of making distinctions between this and not that, and trying to say one is good, the other is evil. Oftentimes making a huge mess of things, when I think what the return, kind of on the far end of history is, and even as we see these interesting studies of consciousness, is that there's a mutuality between subject and object. What is the binding agent there? It's love.
Mhm.
Right.
And so, and we've talked about it in the past, is you can't know anything truly unless you love it. At an ontological level, you cannot know a thing's thingness unless you have engaged, like in the sense of Bergson, there's a sympathetic relationship between subject and object.
Yeah, and what's interesting.
Also, in that perfect knowledge and perfect love, there ceases to be a clear line between like self and the other, because I mean that's the way that the Father knows the Son, which is why the Son can be fully identified with the Father, because of the perfection of that knowledge and love.
Right, and Jordan Wood brings that out in his book that's coming out this fall on Maximus the Confessor, and he employs some interesting Hegelian logic in his kind of understanding of Maximus's Neo-Chalcedonian thought, is that what you have in Christ is the identity of identity and difference, is the
Mhm.
meeting point of the finite and the infinite, and it's always present in Christ. And that's the perfect meeting point. And so difference is not bad. Like, we don't get into like that pure monism. We get into what I think is more of a dialectical or a relational monism, where that divine oneness is expressed in the identity and the difference and in multiplicity. And so the hard part is that because we're all so fractured and so dislocated from God's love, we're trying to figure it out. And Dugin, bless him, he's trying to figure something out. I think at some level, even you see the grasping tone of his writings, that he's really reaching for something. But to arrive there is to, I think, maybe come to a point where it's like we aren't going to figure this out, and our efforts to figure it out may bring us closer to our ruin than it will bring us back to paradise. We're not going to get back to paradise by getting the tree of the knowledge of good and evil right for the first time. And so, to me, that's where, like, I'm less enamored with the thought, but I'm very appreciative of the problems he identifies, because they are real problems, and they're worth looking at and speaking to. But in terms of the way it's playing itself out geopolitically at the moment, that's where there's real concern. This is a kind of ideology that is animating conflict.
Yeah, but from both sides, though.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
Well,
Both
Yeah.
sides.
I mean,
Yeah.
that is not absolving the West in any way of our
I
brutality.
just watched JFK Revisited. Has anyone seen the Oliver Stone documentary?
I heard it was good.
Mm.
It's
Yeah,
sobering.
That's part of
Sobering.
the so I just had a talk with this guy. He's got a channel, Trey Telos Bound. He's a 18-year-old kid, and he's read Zizek, he's read philosophy, he just was baptized into the Orthodox Church last week, right? And we were talking about this notion in Hegel, kind of see the Hegel, the dialectic as a bastardized trinity, right? You have this thesis, antithesis, right? And then out of these two forces, the thing and the thing against the thing, right? Whether it's an argument or whatever it may be, something new emerges and at a higher level, and that's the synthesis. And we were talking about this theorist Todd McGowan, who wrote a book called The Emancipation of Hegel. And he says that it's not a negation, right? It's not like a thesis is negated and then it's in its negation, in its synthesis, there's a new higher order that's created, and each synthesis is an explication of the contradiction inherent in our world. Right. And it made me think of this idea that contradiction is revelatory. Right. So pointing to Dugin, pointing at all these contradictions, he's pointing to the stuff in our environment that we maybe didn't see before. So we're seeing more of it as he's pointing it out, not just him, many others that are pointing out the inherent, now more blatant. Like, for a simple example, coronavirus happens, there's measures that are questionable. They try the measures, they don't work, they use the measures again. It's like, wait, what's happening there? That's, so that's a contradiction that's revealing the apocalypse in terms of the revealing, right? It's being revealed that, and I think that's where you can look at this idea. And I think it goes to the very heart of psychoanalysis, which sees the subject, the human subject, as a void. That's this negation of the negation. So from Zizek, Lacan, Freud, even at the very kernel of human beingness, of subjectivity, is the abyss, is the void, right? And it's like, Dugin says that, there's being and nothingness. In order to get to being again, we have to go through nothingness. So we have to go through the void, right? While all these psychoanalytic theorists, they stop at the void and they say that, our neurosis comes from trying to fill a void that can never be filled. So we're always chasing ideologies, idols. And when we grasp them, they go through our fingers, and then we look for the next one, in a sense. And he says that's what constitutes human subjectivity. And it's like, no, it's not. Like, and if you go back to Christ and his teaching and his work, I think it's all there. And I think that's an answer to Hegel, and I think it's an answer to the psychoanalytic problem. There's an answer to it, and it's in Christ. But that's the thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like the
Which is the correct answer to the question is, what is the subject of history?
Yeah, well, the biblical concept of the void, right? There is a biblical void, but it's not void. It's called the depths.
Right.
And it's a place of both. It's a place of both threat and potential and discovery, and ultimately, the depths are where our cry to God emanates from, right? And even like you get into maybe like Dionysus the Areopagite and his concept of like the dazzling darkness, and that there is a sense of void, but the psychoanalytic school just looks at it as a nil, as a nothing. Nihil, right? And it's like, no, there's positive content down there. and God's down there, and there's no depth in the depth to which God is not present.
There's no opening back up to the hole, as like Harding would have it.
So I would say
for
that's what
example.
Dugin is trying to get to in his clumsy way.
I think
right?
so.
He says
Yeah.
we need
He
to
is
get
trying to get to the
to
right
the
place.
radical, the root,
Yes.
where there's this chaos, this
And
depth
he's-
of chaos.
And I think it's right to extend the invitation to go into the darkness, right? I think that that's right. And I can say that with confidence because God is everywhere present, filling all things, right? So on the basis of that, I'm not talking about becoming evil or, you know, I believe that everybody is leaning towards the good, including Dugin, right? And so, and I think it was Jason Almontree said recently in one of his talks that, I don't know if he put it in these terms, but there is no Antichrist without Christ,
Mhm.
right? Christ brings Antichrist into the world. And the idea that Yeats had with slouching towards Bethlehem, right, is, I think, illustrative of that concept, that of this coincidence of opposites, right? This is what my conversation with Jess and Luke was the other day, you know, of being able to transcend these things by synthesizing them. I'm not familiar with Hegel, but synthesizing them in a way that allows you to walk on water, right? Not fall into the multiplicity, not fall into the particular, not fall into the chaos. And that is Christ, because he's all those things, right? He's everything and he's nothing. It's all there.
Well, I think that's exactly it, Sherry, is like, you know, and that was just a constant problem of what Israel is struggling with God in the Psalms, right? Is the problem of not just the presence of God, which creates certain problems, right? It's the longed for problem, but then you're exposed in the presence of God. You become aware of your sinfulness. But then there's also that cry in the absence of God. And the absence is just presence by another means, right? And it's revealing the presence in the darker, it's the revelation of the majesty in the minor chords versus the major chords.
Well, you know, Yosef was talking about the Passover rituals of seeking for things, right? Because it's indicative of the hiddenness of God in the world. And I can't remember, I put a quote in from Callisto Swear this morning on the Voxer, where there was a Jewish rabbi and he said, or Callisto Swear was talking about how deflated you would have been as a child if you were hiding, if you found a really good place to hide and then nobody found you, right?
Mhm.
And you came out and all your friends were gone home and nobody found you, and you had the best hiding place ever. And this rabbi reiterates that in a story, which I have yet to read, that is how it is for God, right? He's found the perfect hiding place and he comes out of it and we're all gone. And nobody found him.
There's almost a Sophianic intuition in some ways in his epilogue, or what is it, in the afterword, where he talks about the metaphysics of chaos, because he's talking about the way he's talking about chaos. He's talking about chaos in terms of like the divine feminine, and your idea of talking about veiling made me think of that. So there's definitely talking about in terms of the divine feminine, and that is interesting. But I still think he makes a mistake in wanting to reject logos, because you need to have both the essential pull and the substantial pull.
Yeah, he has this notion of the dark logos. Have you heard that?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with it. I just kind of know it tangentially.
I've heard it mentioned, but I don't know what it is. Yeah.
He's got a good quote from
Nietzsche here. Okay, go for it.
So he's talking about here, why aren't we talking about God? Why are we talking about this chaos? And he says, I'll just read the paragraph here. It says, if we focus on the subject of the fourth political theory, meaning Dasein, we will understand that it does not belong to the horizontal disposition between these two columns. So the column between the subject and the object, right? He's saying that postmodernism blurred the line between subject and object, but it doesn't even consider the vertical and depth dimensions. So he wants to do what postmodernism did to the materialist dimension of blurring between subject and object. He wants to flip that and do that to the vertical and the depth directions. But he says, don't worry about the vertical now, the spirit, the divine, focus on the depth, the root. And it's what he's getting at here. He says, why do we talk about the roots, but not the head? This is a very serious and deep moment, because we should realize the reduction that is being made. If we realize that the horizontal reduction first, and we get an unsatisfactory result, we will conclude that we should instead realize the vertical reduction to move towards ontic roots, but not ontological heights. Therefore, we should postpone such notions as the dimension of spirit and the divine and move towards chaos and other vertical and depth-oriented concepts. And he finally brings in this Nietzsche quote. He says, Nietzsche said, not when truth is dirty, but when it is shallow, the seeker of knowledge steps reluctantly into the water. So that means to me, we need to get to a point where we can dip our toe into that darkness, that dazzling darkness, right? It made me think of, this inherent sterilization of death and the fear of death in our culture, right? So anything in these, shallow, deep waters, he says, if it's shallow enough, you'll dip your toe in. So I think that's what he's trying to orient us to look. And that's why I think it's partly why it's so uncomfortable, but I don't know about that. It just kind of came to me just now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that chaos is a kind of an interesting space. And I look at that as it is the impeller of the growth of creation. I mean, we even know that mathematically at chaos theory and how that is related to fractal geometry and the creation of complex systems, right? There is a chaos at the heart of creation. But to me, that's just a difference principle. It's self-similarity, and it's representational. And so there's always this mirroring reality of like, but not like, that is always growing throughout creation. And so his wanting to get close to that, I'm sympathetic to that. I think that our relationship to that has to be a loving relationship. And what I see is more his rhetoric is so martial, so I think what it ends up doing is it ends up using chaos as a weapon versus using chaos as a tool, and like an artist's paintbrush is a tool, and you can use chaos in brilliant and wonderful ways.
Right, because he talks about chaos in contradictory ways. So he talks about it in that, where James was just reading. He's talking about this sort of chaos and more of the ancient Greek sense, as opposed to the postmodern sense. But he goes back and forth between those modes of talking about chaos, which kind of confuses the issue. And I think, as you indicated earlier, I think it's using confusion on purpose as a tool. But in this section where he's talking, in as much as he's talking about chaos and that older notion of chaos, which is associated with the divine feminine, I think there's something particularly Russian about that. I don't know why it is, but there seems to be a particular connection between Russia and this concept of the divine feminine. I think that's why you see sophiology being developed within Russia, and you also have the tradition of using Sophia in the naming of churches. You have the Russian pagan figure of the snow maiden. You also have the dark chaotic figure of Baba Yaga too, at the same time, which is sort of the dark aspects of the divine feminine. So there's some kind of special connection there, I think, which is almost kind of the fact that the Fatima prophecies allegedly involved the Blessed Virgin's concerns for Russia, almost reinforce that too.
I wonder how much of this is misunderstood. And it's an open question, because Russians or the Russian culture or the Russian way of thinking is hard to understand.
Dugin would say yes.
Definitely.
and that's the core of it.
I'm reading Soloviev and it's cringeworthy sometimes for me reading it, because he talks about a definite Russianness, right? and that they have a calling. And, you know, he uses the same kind of terminology that Dugin uses,
Yeah.
but he critiques the church, the hierarchy of the church, and like the ecclesial hierarchy. And he also critiques their political ties to the government, right? Dugin, I don't know, but I don't think Dugin's doing that.
No, he wouldn't.
And but everything else, like if you just stripped away those critiques from Soloviev, he would sound exactly like Dugin when it comes to Russia. It's very interesting.
Right.
It is a seems to me to be the way Russians think about themselves.
Well, and I think he's right. Like, his like when he gets into kind of his geopolitics and his understanding of what Russia's role is in the geopolitical scene, I think he's honestly right.
Mm.
Because Russia does occupy a very unique position geographically, culturally, historically. It's vastly important, and I think, you know, as a Westerner critiquing Dugin, it's also not without a knowledge of basically since the end of the Cold War and during and prior to, the West has almost always had a very adversarial, especially like the Atlanticist West has had a very adversarial relationship with Russia. And post Cold War, you know, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, we've basically looted Russia.
And not only that, but
Right.
just all countries though, Jed. I mean, after watching that JFK Revisited,
Oh yeah,
JFK
Mhm.
wanted a more of a sober-nosed.
détente. Yeah, he wanted détente with Russia.
Yeah,
Part
and
of
not
it
just
was
with
like-
Russia, but with Cuba and with Egypt and
Syria, Libya,
yeah, all these
Ukraine.
countries, right?
Who is it? What in the West is responsible for these things?
Yeah.
What is it when we say what is sovereign in the West in terms of this discussion of this thing that's exporting color revolutions, chaos, technical consumer society? What is it? I don't
Mammon.
know.
I don't
Yeah.
either. That's a great question, though.
I think it's
Yeah.
mammon. I mean, I think honestly, I
It's
think
mammon?
We're too steeped in it to know.
Yeah.
It's of this. It's not of the flesh.
yeah, there's this sinister spiritual force behind it. I think it's impelled by greed, by people who see an opportunity
Power and
and
power.
power, and it's the power that reinforces the greed. Because essentially, like what happened, you know, under Yeltsin with America and NATO, is we basically stripped everything out of Russia that wasn't nailed down. Right. And there can be all kinds of ideology we can put behind it as far as Atlanticism, but all that stuff. But a lot of it, like if you just step back and take a look, it just looks like greed.
Yeah.
And then underneath that is the willingness to impose that economic advantage through the use of force and political force, and then ultimately military force. And so, like in terms of the violence that we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine today, like the idea that the West does not hold the foundational responsibility and culpability in this. This is not I definitely think that Putin is wrong in his invasion of Ukraine. I think it's atrocious and abysmal, but I'm not naive to the fact that we, in a sense, have baited him into that. And I kind of wonder if that's not what we did.
Oh,
And I kind of wonder that if that's not what they're, you know, that's what they're doing on purpose to show the contradiction within what
Right.
the West, this thing of the West, to disclose to the world. You know, once you start digging into Ukraine, you start watching some of the Oliver Stone films, Ukraine on Fire and Ukraine Revisited. You look at his as a film on JFK, and you see what the CIA, and then if you look at the roots of the CIA with the OSS and kind of Nazi Germany, it goes into a deep rabbit hole. But that is the disclosure. That's what's being revealed, and it has to be done. And I think,
that's why I
yeah.
say it's burning, like Rome is fricking burning, and people are
Yeah.
just, you know, they're confused.
yeah,
But we should be
Yeah.
the ones bringing buckets of water to those burning buildings, as
Mm.
opposed to like lighting more
Yesterday.
fires.
Mhm.
You know what I
Right.
mean? Like that's the side of it that it's like, yeah, it's burning and it's a problem, and we may not
That's
be.
what I meant.
You know,
when I
this
was
is
following
this
speech.
this makes me think of what Sherry was talking about earlier, and because like we're kind of getting into this idea of like, well, what is the difference between like a state and a nation? You know, because a lot of we're talking about like, you know, government actions, the actions of the state, but there's but the idea of a nation is certainly older than the modern idea of the state. And I found myself having a very contradictory. I'll just make fun of myself a little bit here for the sake of illustrating my point. Tom Belt, Jed, our mutual friend, he posted something about like, how do you feel about pledging allegiance to the flag as a Christian? And had just woken up from a nap, and I was in this kind of liminal state of consciousness. And it's like I read that, and it's like, oh, I knew for sure I had zero problem with it all, no problem with it whatsoever. And even though I'm a self-professed Christian anarchist, I had no problem with that whatsoever. Nor do I have any problem with, people being enthusiastically rooting for Team USA or any kind of like, harmless display of patriotism. So, and I had to be honest with myself about like, so I kind of made a joke. I said, I kind of confessed that I was like just waking up from a nap, and I had no explanation of my answer. And I'm like, it made me have to consider like, maybe John Milbank and his political thinking is a little closer to right, and I'm a little closer to wrong. But there's something that I'm not understanding, and that maybe my mistrust of the state is well placed, but there's something about the concept of a nation that is deeper than that.
Mm.
And Sherry, I'd like you to address it, since you're the one who brought up this idea of we have nations for a reason from the divine perspective. I'd like you to be able to say what you think first.
Well, I don't know if I could add more to what I already said. I can't help think about Cyrus and Darius and Nebuchadnezzar and how they were used. And, we're worrying about Dugin and Putin, but honestly, if God deems it valuable, they'll be out on their hands and knees for 7 years chewing on the grass with the cows, right? Like, that's how I feel. And I mean,
Maybe nations are controlled by angels and states by egregores.
Well,
I don't know the difference, actually. Like,
the biblical
state was always a communist term for me, and it was more patriotic, right? But there is definitely a spirit attached to the idea of nation, because people, even though they don't maybe live within the nation, reflect that spirit. I've seen it. I've seen people who are born in Canada to immigrant parents or immigrant grandparents, let's say Sudanese or Ukrainian or whatever, German, and their nation is represented in them, even though they never grew up there, right? Or maybe are twice removed from it. And I find that really interesting. And they do act like bodies of something. They have a not just a shared, not a history, but they move in a way, they contribute to the world in a way. I've talked to my husband about this, about Switzerland, for example, and the contributions, and I know Switzerland's made negative ones, but there are a lot of positive contributions to the world from Switzerland, right? And the way that Germany has acted in the very distant past and the more recent past and the now even. I don't see the activity. It might look different, but it isn't really different,
Well, here's the thing: is the state. I don't think that there's any place ultimately in an enduring sense of the state. The state, as we know it, is a function of early modernity, grows out of capitalism in the post-Westphalian state.
Yeah.
The nation state is not the nations.
That's right. It's
Yeah.
a much later conception. Yeah.
Whether it's in Greek in ta ethne or in Hebrew as hagoyim, right? We're talking about the peoples and their distinct identity as peoples, and as groups of people is different than the political arrangements. And even when we get into biblical concepts of empire, whether that's Persia or Babylon, these are already multi-ethnic or multi-peopled dynamics under a larger conglomerate of political arrangements. So the political arrangements and the idea that like there is a distinct Russian identity as a nation state, I will challenge Dugin on. Is there a real Russian identity, though? I would say yes, and it's a valuable one, and it's an important one in the legacy of world history.
See, I
Well,
think Dugin is struggling toward that identity, but doing it badly, though.
Yeah.
Well,
To be
it's a
fair to
thousand,
him,
it's 1,000 years old. You know, it has a definite, not a definite, but a time and a place that it emerged. You know, Oswald Spengler talks about civilizations have they're organic and they have a body and they have a life cycle. And he actually says that Russia is in the spring of its life cycle and the West is in its decline. You know, Russia started, you know, in Ukraine really in the 900s around there.
yeah,
So there is something there, if you think from a materialist and a semi-spiritual perspective, that gives the Russian folk, the Russian people, their identity. But to your point, you know, and to your point, Sherry, my entire family lineage grew up in Greece. You know, my mom got pregnant with me in Greece and then moved to America for the first time. You know, they didn't speak the language or anything. And I feel American. It's part of my identity.
Right.
And I think part of the uncomfortableness of uncovering what has been done under the name of America, you know, all of these things that we're seeing, it's uncomfortable for people because they're American. It's part of our identity. There's no getting out of that. But to your point, like I consider myself a Greek American, but what is this idea of a Greek, right? The Greek Hellenic nation has been around since the 1800s in its current political form, right? But then you go deeper than that, obviously it's thousands of years old. So it's hard to really demarcate the appropriate, you know, constellation of ideas that make up a people and a culture. So I'm with you.
I'm just going to ask you this really dumb question, James. What did you major in?
In college?
Yeah.
Political science and philosophy. Go figure. Go figure.
Case closed.
Right?
yeah. You know, it's funny. I've had German coworkers in the past that have said to me that even if it wasn't for your surname, I would have known you're of German ancestry because there's just something very German about you. So I don't. Yeah. So
You just reflected a piece of my identity back to me that I wasn't really aware of so succinctly. That was pretty cool. That was pretty cool.
And I think that that's a really interesting thing, James. Like what you're talking about, I think hits on, I think, the positive role of the nation or nations, right? I mean, like baseball and apple pie and Thanksgiving dinner and like rock and roll and, you know, like the things that are quintessentially American. And they arise in our culture, our unique cultural context, but these are valuable. I mean, the rest of the world loves this stuff for them. I mean, not an unqualified love, but they love elements of American culture that are really cool. I mean, it's just cool, you know, like, I mean, only in America are you going to have the emergence of like skateboarding and, you know, like competitive surfing, which I grew up around in Southern California. And, you know, it's like, there's some cool stuff that we've done. Right. But you have to, like, the difficulty that you're identifying is like that's against the backdrop of a very dark political legacy that goes back to our very beginnings. Right. So you have like the good and the bad growing together.
So what is the political meaning of this distinction that we're making between the state and the nation?
Well, I wanted to read a little Soloviev, if I could, because he actually talks about it for a minute. It's
Okay.
I'm listening, by the way. I just got to take care of something in my living room, so I'll be able to hear all you guys. So
yeah. In accepting the essential and real unity of humankind, and one rightly should accept it because it is a religious truth justified by rational philosophy and confirmed by exact science, in accepting this substantial unity, we should consider the whole of humanity like a great collective being or a social organism of which different nations represent the living parts. It is evident from this point of view that no people would know how to live in itself, for itself, and by itself, but that the life of each people is nothing but a particular participation in the general life of humanity. The function that a nation should fulfill as being an organ, that is its true national idée in French, eternally fixed in the plan of God. But if it is true that humanity is a grand organism, it is still necessary to realize that it is not an organism that is purely physical, but that the members and elements of which it is composed, nations and individuals, are moral beings. Now, the essential condition of a moral being is that the particular function which it is called to fulfill in the life of the whole, the idea that determines its existence in the thought of God, is never imposed as a material necessity, but only as a moral obligation. God's thought, which is an absolute fatalism for non-rational things, is only a duty for a moral being. But if it is evident that a duty can be fulfilled or not, can be fulfilled well or badly, can be accepted or rejected, still one would not know how to admit, on the other hand, that this liberty could change the providential plan or take away the efficacy of the moral law. The moral action of God cannot be less powerful than his physical action. It is necessary, therefore, to recognize that in the moral world, there is also a fatalism, but a fatalism that is indirect and conditional. And then he just goes on and on into this whole idea, but then he says, he talks about the empirical method of figuring out a nation and state, which is what we were just doing. And then he says, this empirical method to get at the truth is absolutely impracticable where national opinion is divided, which is almost always the case. What is the true opinion of the public of France? That of the Catholics, or that instead of the Freemasons? And since I myself am Russian, to which of the national opinions should I sacrifice my own subjective ideas? To that of official and officious Russia, the Russia of today, or instead to that which many millions of our old believers profess, these true representatives of traditional Russia, the Russia of the past, for whom our current church and state are the empire of the Antichrist, he says. Or for that matter, should we deliver ourselves over to the nihilists who possibly represent the future of Russia? So it's a short little book and it's really good. And he talks about the nations as organs in this body of humanity. And I think that's the best way to think about it, actually.
Oh, and it recapitulates the body of Christ.
It does.
And I guess
What we essentially believe,
And
right?
not in the monstrous way that Hobbes does with his image in Leviathan. Yeah.
Well,
So if you're plugged into Christ appropriately, you can be an American and cherish that identity if it's in the hierarchy appropriately. If it's not, then it's pathological. So
Yeah.
the fractals have to be nested within each
Yep.
other appropriately, in a sense.
Well, and vertically and horizontally, and in every direction, that multi-directional. I guess this is kind of like I do have to get back to work here, but I guess like my sense is, and it kind of flows out of some of the stuff I read in John Bear, right? And his insight, I think, is like one of the most earth-shattering ones I've ever heard and encountered, is that creation is happening at the cross.
Yeah.
And what is happening at the cross also is that the Leviathan and Behemoth are being exposed and conquered. That same chaos comp that we see in the creation motifs throughout the Hebrew Bible is playing itself out throughout history. And so it's the cross that's overcoming that. And it's the message of the cross of a God who's giving himself utterly for and as the life of his own creation. And so, to me, like the question of, well, how do the nations escape the state? I feel like it's the enslavement to Leviathan and Behemoth. And it's that creation that's groaning and languishing for this revelation of the sons and daughters of God in glory. And so what does that look like? Well, it's the renovation that is taking place ontologically at the cross. That is the new creation, and which is the creation.
Right. And I think the cross is the synthesis of good and evil, because it is God dying, right, through pain and suffering, which is what we consider. If you think about it in those terms, I mean, this is the way I've been thinking about it lately, that Christ is taking all of that coincidence of opposite, that we live in a world of pain and suffering, right? And that we are loved by a good God who is everywhere present, filling all things. And how do we reconcile those two things? At the cross.
Right. And I think this has to do with like time and space. And I don't know if you remember when we were doing ML Box, Apocalypse John, this idea of time becoming space.
Yeah.
It also reminds me of Robert Jensen has a line, Jed, that kind of reminds me of like what you were talking about as well. Jensen says that time is a double helix with Christ at its center.
And even
Yeah.
quite literally, when you do the cross, right, in Orthodoxy, everything is there, right? You have
Yes.
the Trinity, right? The
Mhm.
Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, the divinity and the humanity of Christ.
Yeah.
And then when you do your cross, you reflect heaven, earth, your past, and your future, and you're there in the center. Your heart's in the center. The cross is literally right here, and
Yeah.
everything's just folded into that.
Yeah.
But guys, I gotta jump off too.
Yeah, just
my
one
kids
last,
are racking
yeah,
it up.
if I just like, I think like that last thing you just said, if I could just like kind of little closing remark, I think that idea, that like beating heart of a real relational person, I think that's both the proper political subject and the proper subject
Orientation.
of time as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Because
so
it's time and space too. And in
correct.
the middle, the appropriate mediation of time and space is Christ.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Right in the
Amen.
middle.
Amen.
So
That's a great note to end on.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.
Yeah.
This was
great.
Sorry,
Thank you
sorry we
very
went over a little bit.